Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Kenneth Lapatin, curator of Antiquities at the Getty Villa, and I'm joined by my dear colleague, Lisa Çakmak, who is chair of the arts of the ancient Mediterranean and Byzantium at the Art Institute of Chicago. For today's program, Portable Art, the Fashion and Function of Ancient Gems. This program is part of the Getty Museum's new Art Break series, where we invite you to take 30 minutes out of your day and join us for a closer look at some of the items in our collection. Before we begin, just a couple of reminders. Please submit any questions you have at any point during the program via the Q&A panel, and we will answer as many as we can at the end of our presentation. Also, this program is being recorded and will be posted on the Getty Museum's YouTube channel in the coming weeks. Today, Lisa and I are pleased to be looking at with you this wonderful Amethyst Intaglio of Demosthenes signed by Dioscorides. Now, Lisa, that's a lot to unpack. Let's just start with amethyst.
Right, so amethyst is a purple crystalline quartz. It's really quite a stunning visual effect with the purple. It comes from the ancient Egyptian desert or India, and it's often associated in antiquity with either the goddess Aphrodite or the god Dionysus. And here's where there's kind of a funny little false etymological story for those etymology nerds out there like Ken and I. Dionysus, the god of wine and sort of associated with drunkenness. Amethyst means sort of a not drunk or against drunkenness, but it's not actually the root of the word amethyst, which is kind of funny. Then we have the next part of our tongue twister, Ken, intaglio.
Yeah, intaglio is a modern word from the Italian intagliare. Some of you may eat tagliatelle pasta, and that's long strips of pasta that are cut from a sheet. Tagliare is to cut. So an intaglio is something that is cut in. Although you might not see it in this photograph, everything you see, the head of the bearded figure here, is cut into the gem, which could be used as a seal when pressed into wax or clay or plaster or some other soft material. It would leave an impression in relief. So that's what intaglio means. The figure depicted here is Demosthenes.
And Demosthenes, what's interesting here is an actual person. So this is a portrait of Demosthenes, the Athenian statesman who lived in the 4th century BCE. And the gem that we're talking about today dates to about 25 BCE. So what's the math there? Several centuries after his death. He was much admired by the Greeks and later by the Romans, so much so that there was an honorific portrait set up to him, and his visage, his personage, and everything that he represents sort of stayed current and stayed important to the Greeks and then to the Romans.
Yeah, his statues were erected in public places, in libraries, but also in diverse media, in small statuettes and in gemstones. He was a symbol of public virtue, of looking out for your commonwealth, of also being a great rhetorician. Here's another intaglio with the head of Demosthenes, not by Dioscorides and not an amethyst. This is a stone we call a nicolo, a banded blue stone, and you can see the same figure copied from this very famous honorific statue we know made by Polyeuctos in Athens, voted by the Athenian assembly to commemorate Demosthenes after his death, but he remained popular for hundreds of years. And we don't always know why people had him on their gems. But it's interesting that during the Roman civil wars, around the time our gem was carved, and just before, the statesman Cicero in Rome attacked Mark Antony, the lieutenant of Caesar. And he made a series of speeches against Antony that he called Philippics. And he took the title from Demosthenes' speeches against Philip of Macedon. So it seems that Demosthenes could serve as an anti-Etonian pro-Republican symbol. So this imagery could be personal, but it could also be political, and we don't know in this case.
It's interesting. I like to liken studies of ancient gems and seal impressions. I sometimes make the comparison to bumper stickers and sort of like wearing your personal or political allegiance on your car, or in this case, on your person. We should point out, Ken, right, that this example is probably far more, this is an example that was far more common in antiquity. The amethyst of Dioscorides, by Dioscorides, is like not just the 1%, but that is the 0.01%. I mean, this is the gem cutter of Augustus, which you'll talk about in a minute. But the ring here from the Thorvaldsen Museum is probably much more standard and what, you know, sort of a regular person would have worn. And it's interesting too that the way Demosthenes is depicted here is in profile. And so this would have been an easier image to cut, and you know, it's just a little bit less fancy.
Absolutely, but they're all cut basically by the same techniques, and it's the same techniques that gem engravers use today, except today gem engravers have electric power tools. And we're not going to talk a lot about technique today, but a few years ago, the master gem engraver, contemporary gem engraver Çavdar Çushev, made a short video that you can find on the Getty's YouTube channel, and I think a link just went into the chat for that. But you can see a very small, almost like dental tools that would be spinning on a wheel, were dipped in abrasive and used to cut the stone. And as that happened, both the stone and the abrasive and even the tool wore into a dirty slurry. So a lot of the time, carvers couldn't exactly see what they were doing as they were doing it. They'd have to wipe away the detritus, look at it maybe in an impression. And here you see the moment when Çavdar Çushev is actually signing his signature in the margin of this replica of an earlier Greek intaglio in the Getty collection. And if we jump forward to a detail of our gem by Demosthenes, you can see on the edge in minute letters, less than a millimeter tall, the name of Dioscorides, in the genitive case in Greek, Dioscoridou, of or by Dioscorides, cut into this beautiful amethyst.
And the quality, like I said, is just extremely, extremely high. Here we see not a profile view, but sort of a 3/4 facing view. And the detail that you can see just from this image. And what's interesting, I learned from you, Ken, while we were preparing for this, you can actually see a little bit of damage as well in the gem. It's probably post-antique damage, right? From someone trying to gouge out maybe leftover wax or clay, trying to clean the surface at the lips as well.
And those are the deepest parts of the gem. Well, the nose is actually the deepest. You have to remember, you're looking at illusionistically at reverse. So this is the surface. Along the edge of the face, you can see a lot of scratches and damage, but deep within, these are flaws. But the modeling of the flesh of the brow, the hair of the beard, the penetrating eyes is really unparalleled in gem carving.
But of course, we are looking at it pretty zoomed in, and this would not necessarily have been one's interaction with this seal in antiquity or sort of during its original life. It would have been worn either in a ring, set into a ring in a bezel, or maybe as a pendant. And if it was set as a pendant, maybe it was backed by something. So that would have changed how the light would have gone through and hit the gem. So it's important to remember here, one of the great things about this presentation is we're able to zoom in and, shout out to the Getty photography staff for being able to do all the things that you need to do to get these beautiful pictures.
Yeah, in antiquity, these things would have been worn on the body, so they're very personal. They were used as insignia, so they encompass in some way the self-identity and self-presentation of the individual, even if this wasn't the gem of Demosthenes with his own portrait, somebody else wore it with his portrait. And of course, the ancients could look at these things on their rings, hold them to the light, manipulate them, something that Lisa and I are privileged as curators to be able to do with the gems in our collection. But I'm reminded of a story from the Renaissance when Lorenzo de' Medici wanted to buy gems from Venice. He became impatient because his agent in Venice wasn't writing to him or sending him any gems. And the agent responded to the complaint saying, my lord, I'm so sorry. The light is bad here. It's Venice, it's winter, it's overcast. There hasn't been sunshine for a month. We can't really look at the gems. So in this wonderful photograph by Tawny Cracchiola, I want to give a shout out to particularly our staff photographer at the Getty Villa. You can really see ideally just how wonderful the carving is on this gem. And in the next slide, we have the gem itself and a modern impression of the gem in silicon in relief, which shows you how it would have left an impression. You can also see the signature here now reads forwards. It was carved backwards. Lisa, you compared this kind of thing to like Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire in an earlier conversation.
Yeah, because it's, when you think about the gem cover, in this case with Intaglio, they're carving in the negative. So like Ginger Rogers had to do everything Fred Astaire did, but backwards and in heels. And so the gem carver is doing this somewhat blind. And actually earlier this week, we were having a chat about what kind of magnification was available. They didn't, I'm going to guess Chavdar wears some kind of goggles to magnify the surface of the gem, but that wasn't an option in antiquity, which I think leads us to one more aspect of this that we haven't quite finished unpacking, but that's our friend Dioscorides. I mean, this is an object by the master gem carver Dioscorides. To have something signed by an ancient artist is exceptionally rare. We know of artists, we know of painters like Apelles and Zeuxis. We know of great famous sculptors like Polykleitos or Praxiteles, but we don't often have their original works. They were destroyed at some point. And here we have the thing. And it's kind of amazing to imagine, I don't have this experience in Chicago, but Ken could go to the Getty and he could hold this in his hands and be touching the same exact thing that the master Dioscorides was holding all those years ago, which I just think is.
Yeah, it's very exciting because in so many other of the arts of antiquities, we've lost the top of the production. We're left with Roman copies. We don't have Polyeuktos' statue of Demosthenes. We have marble versions. This is Dioscorides' version of that, but we don't know for whom it was carved. We don't know its ancient owner. It's recorded as early as 1602 in Rome. It may never have gone underground. And we showed you the gem also from the Thorvaldsen Museum, which was found in northern Italy at the site of Aquileia, as you see here. This imagery was spread widely across the Roman Empire. At the site of Zeugma in southeastern Turkey, we haven't found gems of Demosthenes or even gems, but we found the remains of an archive where clay impressions called bullae have the stamps of now lost gems that were used to seal documents wrapped around papyrus. And here we see another Demosthenes. And this shows us something of the use. And it's to the south in Israel, modern Kadesh, that Lisa has done a lot of work on the collection of bullae there.
Yeah, and so it's funny, this is how I come into this conversation. Ken kind of comes to it from the 0.01%, and I come to it from the more archaeological sort of perspective of the object that was made using these rings and these seals. So I spent a lot of time excavating at the site of Kadesh in Israel, and I saw Sharon Herbert. Shout out to Sharon Herbert. I saw her log on earlier. So at Zugma, I should just point out, so at Zugma, the archive there is 140,000 seal impressions. And at Kadesh, we have about 2,000 seal impressions. But what the larger point here is that we have a lot of seal impressions, and in some cases, more seal impressions than actual rings or gems that made them. But what was really cool about the archive at Kadesh that I got to study is the variety of symbols and motifs that were on the seal impressions from the site. So on this slide, you can just see, just a teeny fraction of the types of symbols that were impressed into these clay blobs. An anchor right in the middle. We have some portraiture. We have inscribed down at the bottom, the grapes with the name Kudissos on it. Next to it is a Phoenician inscription with the sign of Tanit that says "He who is over the land." But then you see also sort of more familiar Greek mythological figures like Eros or Apollo or Artemis. And what's really remarkable about this corpus of seal impressions is this variety for where we are in the world. We are in kind of the boonies. I mean, if I was being very formal, I would call it the Phoenician hinterland, but we're kind of in the boonies. And so to have this kind of breadth of iconographic subject is I think really interesting. And one of the things about gems and the impressions made my gems that is really interesting is that it's sort of can be reflective of a larger segment of the population or a different segment of the population.
What I love, Lisa, about this selection is not only the imagery that's so varied, and we see this imagery in other media. The Eros and the dolphin appears frequently in mosaics, the thunderbolt in architecture, but in the two middle slides, the anchor and the thunderbolt, we also see something about the use and the people and the objects behind the impressions.
Right.
Can you talk about those, please?
Those ridges on the side of the anchor, you might be wondering what are those? Is that a blur in the image? No, those are the fingerprints of the person who made this impression. And then on the thunderbolt to the right, you can see the bezel of the ring. So the gem or the piece of glass or the stone would have been set into a ring, a metal ring, and you can see that seam around the thunderbolt. And so it's kind of like with the Dioscorides gem, when you hold it, you're like holding something that Dioscorides made. With these bullae, this was something made, not only made by an individual, but this imagery was selected by an individual for a particular reason.
And unfortunately, we often don't know what that reason is. We don't know who chose Demosthenes and why for Dioscorides' gem, but we can imagine it had political significance at the time. From Kadesh, we have we think, portraits of individuals, but whether these individuals own these gems or maybe they were somebody's father or uncle or master, we don't know exactly.
Yeah, I mean, they're not labeled. And one thing that, Ken and I really want to make clear is that portraits kind of like these, this is not, it's actually not like modern photo ID. So people would have, individuals would have had a signet or a ring, but it wouldn't have been of themselves necessarily. And so it might have been, but not necessarily. Exactly, but not necessarily. And so, it can be a slippery slope, and one of the sort of challenges of interpreting this material. So, I think we have the anecdote, right, of Augustus. He had 3 different sealed devices, right, Ken?
Throughout his life, we know from the literary sources, he changed his seal device. when he was a young man, he found, we're told, in his mother's drawer, a box with jewelry that had two identical seals of a sphinx. And he used that as his signet, and he gave one to his lieutenant. So it was very convenient to have two. But this, the Sphinx is a tricky creature. It's monstrous, doesn't necessarily bring good news. He decided to give this up, and he moved to a signet of Alexander the Great, maybe even Alexander the Great's signet, which he somehow received. But this also maybe didn't carry the right political connotations after he was successful in the wars. And so his final gem was the one carved by Dioscorides, which we don't have. We believe was a portrait of himself and became the imperial signet for several generations through the Julio-Claudians until it changed. So we can see a little bit of the reasons for Augustus choosing what he chose. We also know that before Augustus, Julius Caesar had on his signet an image of his favorite goddess, Aphrodite, to whom he traced his lineage. And from Kadesh, we actually have several bullae depicting Aphrodite, but perhaps not the same Aphrodite that Julius Caesar used.
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time looking at these Aphrodite bullae, and what was so interesting to me is that what is popular in one medium does not necessarily translate to another medium. So here we have this version of Aphrodite Kalipigos, so Aphrodite of the beautiful buttocks or beautiful behind. And what's interesting about the sculpture, of course, is it's 3D. So you can assume, all right, well, the back side of the sculpture is really finely carved, and so this was meant to be seen from the back. But of course, you could always walk around and you could look at her from the front. But with the seal impression, the carver had to pick a point of view. And what we have here is a point of view that is sort of, 3/4 to the back. It shows that was the viewpoint that was meant, that was desirable in this case. And Aphrodite, she's pretty popular at Kadesh. She's not the most popular of the Olympian deities, but she's sort of right in the middle. She's fourth in popularity. And so what's interesting here with this, presentation so far is we've shown you Demosthenes as a sculpture and Demosthenes in a gem, and now Aphrodite in a sculpture and Aphrodite in a gem. And here again, we have this crouching Aphrodite along with a crouching Aphrodite ring and a crouching Aphrodite seal impression from Kadesh. But again, that it doesn't track. So the crouching Aphrodite is not particularly popular at Kadesh. We only have 3 impressions in total from the site. And so it's interesting to me because what I was saying before, the gems would have been owned by a much larger spread of the population from antiquity, whereas these sculptures would have been in elite homes and civic centers, civic buildings. So they appeal, or they need to appeal to different parts of the population. And I think I think that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the gems, we think of them as luxurious, and something like the Demosthenes by Dioscorides was a definite luxury, as Lisa said, for the 0.1%.
That's like Harry Winston. That's
Right.
like a Harry Winston type of thing.
But we didn't show any, but also gems were made out of glass. They could be cast, they could be carved. You could have smaller stones, less well carved stones. Dimitris Planzos, who wrote a wonderful book about Hellenistic engraved gems, wrote a chapter on gems for the masses. We don't think about that, but they were available in smaller stones and less finely carved stones, or in imitations, and they could be widespread. And sometimes we can begin to try to unpack their meanings to the individuals who own them, the economic station of those who own them. And nowhere, of course, more than the Bay of Naples do we have this opportunity. And returning to Herculaneum, which is very dear to us at the Getty Villa, several years ago, many skeletons were found in the boathouse, and one of them was of a woman who had 2 rings, gold rings with gemstones, a green stone that wasn't carved, and this red stone, a cornelian that is carved with figural decoration.
And so it's interesting to think about, all right, well, we know we have the skeletal remains. We can analyze those skeletal remains. We know that this was a fairly well-off person based on bone density and I probably her teeth. She had some gold coins in her pocket, and she is wearing these two nice rings set in gold. So if we look at the one that's engraved, we see a chicken, a hen, with three other little chicks around it. And so we can have this kind of fun exercise of, well, could this be a representation of her as the mother hen and her three children represented as three baby chicks? But we could see it as another way, that this is something she inherited from a family member, and I've made this joke to Ken already this week 3 times, maybe she's a chicken farmer. We don't actually know.
We don't know. We can spin these stories. You know, her skeleton doesn't reveal whether or not she gave birth. So again, even when we have an archaeological context, we don't always have the answers to our questions. I see that we've gone for a little over 25 minutes. This program is scheduled for 30 minutes, but for those of you who can stick around, I think we'll go longer, because I already see in the chat many questions. So, you know, if you're able to stay with us, we'll try to get through as many of these as we can. There are a couple questions from Brad Smith and Stephen Chappell talking about technique, and I encourage you to watch the video. They're about what tools were used, something as hard as quartz, or were there magnifying devices? And quickly, it's not the tools that cut the stone. It's not the bronze or the iron, or modern day the steel that cuts the stone. It's that tool is dipped into an abrasive slurry with emery, corundum, or modern day's diamond, which is even harder. And it's that slurry that cuts the stone. So you could actually engrave gems with wood, or maybe even straw, if you have a harder abrasive slurry, but the stone wears down the tool as well. I'm just going to go forward to an overview slide. The question about magnifying devices, Lisa already mentioned. The same Dimitris Planzos wrote a wonderful article about this in the American Journal of Archaeology in the late 90s. The ancients had rock crystal, which has magnifying properties, but it's not clear that they ever used it for gem engraving. And because myopia, nearsightedness often has an enlarging function, it's thought that sometimes this eye condition that is passed down from father to son, or father even to daughter, we don't know. There may have been female gem carvers in antiquity. They could have had this ocular peculiarity which aided their work.
And we know, like in the case of Dioscorides, right, it was a family business. His sons also were gem carvers, isn't that right?
That's right. We have the signatures of all 3 of Dioscorides' sons, Eutyches, Herophilus, and Helos. And one of them actually says that the family was from Turkey, and they obviously emigrated to Rome. We have a question from Julia Starr-Dresner. How large is the amethyst? It's less than an inch tall. So it's about the size of an olive. So what you're seeing on your screens, depending on how big your screens are, is a great enlargement. There's wonderful detail. Laura Kaiser says, in the close-up of the main object in the upper left, there's a rusty color and some cracks. What is that? That's a great question. I asked that myself. We brought in our conservators. We did scientific tests. It has a kind of golden color even, but it's not gold. It's mineral incrustation over time that's discolored. As Lisa said, this is almost in the state it was when it left the workshop of Dioscorides, and that's what's so exciting, that so many of these gems are virtually unchanged, but it is scratched. There is some damage, and there are these accretions on the gem. Brad Smith asks, have any measurements been made of the card surface finish up to 20K grit, 50K grit, etc.? Not yet, Brad. We know that ancient carvers like modern ones could use gradually more and more refined polishes And at the end, they would have not even used grit, but they could have used felt or cloth or softer substances. We have a question, did J. Paul Getty collect gems? And the answer is not really. He kind of liked big things. He liked marbles, bronzes, mosaics, but a few gems were purchased by the museum very late in Getty's life, before the villa opened, when there was an attempt to broaden the collection beyond his personal collection to make it more of a encyclopedic collection of antiquity for the general public. But Getty had very specific interests. Most of the gems in our collection have been bought since Getty's death in 1976, and the Dioscorides, Demosthenes, we were very lucky to get just in 2019. So it's new to us, but as I said, it's been known and passed through the hands of many illustrious collectors since 1602. We have another question about rock crystal. Bethany Crane says, the early collectors like the Earl of Arundel put together large collections of these items. Do we know how they would acquire them, or how they knew they were genuine at the time?
That's a great question. I don't actually know. I think, I mean, Ken, I know you have worked on.
I've worked a bit on.
Is forgery the right term? It's more of a fake, but like a.
The vocabulary is hard.
Yeah.
We have modern carvers since the Renaissance emulating the ancients,
right?
Often to their own advantage, as Giorgio Vasari says. And we also have unscrupulous collectors and dealers passing off modern work as ancient. And this is one of the problems of the field, because the techniques aren't so different. The stones are the same. These things can't be dated scientifically.
Right.
So if modern carvers make mistakes, they put, the wrong image on the wrong kind of stone. Certain stones like garnets and emeralds came into play after the Eastern conquest of Alexander. If they're carved in archaic style or with archaic signatures, then there's a disconnect. But if the modern carver does everything right, it can be very difficult. And one of the techniques is to trace the history of an individual gem as far back as we can to a time when there wasn't a market for forgeries or the skill to make forgeries. But it's a great question Bethany asks, and I'm not sure I've done it justice here, but there are several techniques for exposing forgeries, but in some cases it's very difficult to know. Another question from Bethany, were portrait gems made of famous individuals of their time made en masse, or would they have been made specifically for events or people?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think one thing that, not to complicate and muddy the waters, but I'm going to go ahead and do it, is that certainly there were portraits of famous people in the form of coins. So coins and intaglio gems are sort of closely related in terms of the techniques. And it is the practice by the Hellenistic period for individuals to put themselves on coins. We know, for example, in Egypt, the Ptolemies minted very large gold coins with their images on it. And these were typically sort of diplomatic gifts. These were not.
And we know the same was done with gems. We have an anecdote that a Roman general in Egypt was given a gem by a Hellenistic king, but he refused to take it because that would imply that he had some loyalty or support for the king. And so you have some of these were mass produced. And of course, as we've seen with the Demosthenes, the same image could be produced by different artists at different levels for different uses.
And as with Demosthenes, over centuries.
Over centuries. Laura Kaiser asks, Lisa, this is one for you. Why are there so many of these bullae found at Kadesh, do you suppose?
So it was probably a regional archive. So it was a storage depot for contracts. All of the bullae from Kadesh were found in one room, in the corner of this Hellenistic administrative center. And interestingly enough, it was the only room that was intentionally destroyed by fire. And we know that from the stratigraphy of the excavations. And so it's an interesting sort of problem when things are destroyed by fire. They are destroyed, except for clay. Clay is hardened and fired. So as far as archives go, this is relatively, it's small-ish. I mean, certainly not the 140,000 bullae from Zeugma, but it's clearly meant to be some kind of regional depot. And so they were storing contracts or, other kind of documentation.
We talked about this a little bit, but maybe it deserves more attention. Molly Baker asks, are there patterns concerning what kind of iconography appears on gems worn by women, such as the hen ring, versus signet rings that were known to be used by men?
So it's very difficult to know. I think, which I think is a deeply unsatisfying answer. So I apologize. I think what we need to think about in terms of the seal impressions and the iconography is who would participate in the signature of a contract or the sort of stamping of a contract. And with that, you need to do a lot of research into the social practice and the socio-political climate of the particular site, whether women would have been privy to a contract, a marriage contract, or was it simply all men? Were women going to pay the taxes as well, or was it just men? So it's really, really hard to know. And when working with the Kadesh material, I really did try and shy away from, I think that this would have been iconography appropriate to a woman and this was iconography appropriate to a man. I just kind of, it's very hard to know.
I agree completely, but there is something else that's really important here, and that's that the ancients had different views of mineralogy or gemology, and they recognized that stones had gender, and some stones were thought to have feminine gender, some masculine gender. The weaker colors were often thought to be feminine, stronger colors men, so that could influence who wore what. And poets and novelists frequently use gems as devices in their stories, and that tells us something. Aeschylus, very early in the 5th century BC, has Electra recognize her brother Orestes because he's wearing their father's ringstone. In the Hellenistic and Roman periods, we have these novels of stories of people getting lost and sold into slavery, but somehow maintaining a ring, or the image of a loved one on a ring, and the gem substituting for the person in these love stories. So these are ancient fictional accounts that aren't truthful, but they inform us about some of the ideas around the use of gemstones and certain motifs. But as we said, we have Aphrodite appearing on Julius Caesar's signet, but it is an armed Aphrodite, so it's maybe
right. It's not one of these sort of semi-nude Aphrodites. I think this is where it's really interesting to have the bullae and the gems, because of course my study of the bullae, we don't have the ring, so I can't say, oh, well, this was made by this type of stone, and we know the literary sources for this. And so it makes putting these two data sets together really interesting and exciting.
And that leads into a question that I think will be our last question, although there are many others, and I'm sorry we can't get to all of them. DC asked, what was the advantage of having the carving be in an amethyst rather than some other stone? Is it just that it's visibly beautiful, or there are other advantages? Lisa spoke earlier about this belief, amethyst amethy non-drunkenness, that would make an amethyst appropriate for an image of Dionysus or a Maenad. For Demosthenes, it's maybe hard to see the connection. Other stones, their colors, or their had properties, and Pliny the Elder, in the final book of his Encyclopedic Natural History, which is devoted to gemstones gives a lot of ancient lore that was picked up in the Middle Ages about the properties of stones. Green stones were thought to be beneficial to the eyes. Yellow stones could protect you from scorpion bites. Certain stones, if you took them out on a full moon with a wolf's hair, could make you invisible. I mean, there's all kinds of ancient beliefs why you would choose a certain stone, but most of these were somewhat exotic in the ancient world. They came from the Egyptian desert.
Right.
They came from India. Some of those origins the ancient sources lied about to make them more exotic, but the stones themselves, you know, were valuable. They gleamed, they glowed in a world without electricity.
Yeah.
They seemed to shine forth. So there's a lot in the stones separate from the imagery.
And I think just to close, you know, first of all, amethyst, it's not like there are tons of amethyst gems from antiquity knocking about out there. This is, it occurs. It's not the most common stone, but I think, you know, the other thing to take away is many of the stones that were used in antiquity are nowadays considered semi-precious. So amethysts, chalcedony, carnelian, whereas nowadays we wear diamonds, emeralds, rubies, and these are sort of like new world stones. They weren't available in antiquity. And so something like this amethyst really was like going into Harry Winston to buy that really, really fancy rock.
Well, that concludes our program. I'm really grateful to Lisa for joining me and sharing her expertise. I'm thankful to all of you for coming and participating with your questions. For those of you who have more questions or we didn't get to your questions, we have them in the chat and we'll go through them and try to answer them for you as best we can. I'm really grateful to everyone for coming this afternoon, but a special shout out not only to our photographer, Tani Cracchiola, who photographed all the Getty gems, but also the Villa programming team, the Getty Villa events department, and our AV specialists, Lisa Guzetta, Shelby Brown, Carly Unger, Heather Licey, Ashley Hayes, Daniela Alvarez, Marvin Jones, and Ron Bunny. It really does take a village.